Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars The Bad Batch episode review. This one's going to be for episode 13, which is called Infested. And I suppose let's just get it out of the way. I wasn't particularly impressed with this episode. I thought it was like aggressively average. Probably definitely the worst episode of the season so far. I just didn't find myself particularly invested in this one, and look, I guess it's set up for probably a season 2 stuff that we're gonna focus on the sort of underworld, the Pikes and stuff like that a little bit more, but this one just really didn't do it for me at all. And you know, every Friday I've kind of been like, the Bad Batch, I'm excited to see what they do. And then this was probably the first episode of The Bad Batch where it was just kind of like, it was a little bit of a slog getting through the episode. And I don't remember too many times that I've said that about The Bad Batch. I think there's been maybe one other episode this season so far that I felt like, this one's not great, but it was better than this. I think there were episodes of Star Wars Rebels, definitely, that felt like, this one's tough to get through. There were episodes of Rebels like this, and this to me is the first like real kind of miss that we I think had this season. I think the problem is just like we're right towards the end of the season here. Like we'd had good setup from the previous episode of like Crosshairs is hunting them, and then immediately we delve into this complete side plot with like Sid and addressing more of that side of things. And at least to me, Sid is just that sort of character where I appreciate the situation, the dynamic that they have with her as the team's sort of handler. I don't really feel like I need that dynamic to be delved into like all the more. In that, for the future of the series, I question as to whether or not like Sid is necessarily a character I think should be a particular focus of the series going forward, just because I almost prefer the Bad Batch do other things than what this maybe seems to be suggesting. But just this one just didn't do it for me. Like they come back from just a mission that I guess we don't really see. Sid has sort of been ousted to a degree by this other guy. He then gets himself into trouble with the Pikes, and they just have to resolve the situation by getting Spice back. And Sid is along for the ride on this mission as well. Omega is used as sort of collateral in all of this with the Pikes, and by the end of it, we get the Spice back to them, but they still want to kill the new guy that sort of took over. They sort of defend his life, and he gets away with just having his horn cut off. And it seems like he might have turned over a new leaf, and we set up, you know, we leave with just the setup of more of this underworld stuff that we might get into at some point. To me, the main hope, I suppose, on that side of things is that they eventually maybe set up the Darth Maul underworld type stuff to, you know, fully clarify the whole situation surrounding him, you know, and his appearance in Solo. That would be cool to see him come back into things in that way. I think that this is the right kind of time period for that. So, you know, that's something I'm invested in, that we're before we get to Maul as he is in sort of Rebels era, but it's you know, before he dies and stuff like that. So it's sort of the last stage in a way of Maul's arc. So if we did that, I suppose that would be relatively okay. But again, that right now isn't particularly related to the events of this episode, in that I already have noticed that there's been a little bit of a kind of, you know, heavy discussion surrounding, you know, should this episode, you know, is it fine to call this episode sort of a quote-unquote filler episode or not? Does every episode need to be super impactful or not? And look, my interpretation of this is just that I do think over the last bunch of years that the term filler has grown from being a primarily anime term to become more of a a criticism term for just basically a very average episode that doesn't really do anything particularly substantial on any of the main notable fronts of telling a story. That being, none of the characters are developed all that much, the plot doesn't advance, and you don't learn anything particularly substantial when it comes to world building. And I think that is this episode. So in the what people now, the modern, I suppose, use of the term filler, I suppose this is a filler episode, but I understand why people still feel it should be primarily held for what it means in terms of anime. But I don't really have an issue with people going quite heavily in on this episode and just being like, yeah, this was not it. At this stage of the season, after what we've just had, what we're trying to set up, this was not an episode to further prove that the show is capable of doing more than it is. Because, yeah, this one, I think, just furthered the point that without the plot there to support the characters of the Bad Batch still don't stand out all that much on their own. This show has definitely helped to make you care more about Wrecker, Hunter, Tech, so on, Omega especially. But Tech is still just Tech. They are not doing anything that resembles a character arc at all with him. He is exactly the same as he was from episode 1, basically. The first time we saw him in the Clone Wars arc. Wrecker, outside of the his fun connection with Omega and then the Chip little arc that we had, is basically just presented as Wrecker in every single situation. Echo feels like such a non-factor given that he's like the new member of the team. We still haven't really done anything of substance with him, so he doesn't stand out, which leaves you with then sort of like, okay, Hunter and Omega, that's the main dynamic, isn't it? But I don't think they've quite done enough over the course of the episodes with Hunter to really establish him as sort of like a true sort of main character level character. He just feels like the competent leader of this group of kind of rather one-note characters. And because he sort of is the most normal of them all, he feels kind of like the best character of the lot. But his arc is still the same general thing each time, and that is that Omega has more sort of, empathy with people. She connects with people in a little bit of a stronger way than the rest of them do. And he kind of is learning from that a little bit to handle the situations a little bit differently. And it's just that sort of replayed out a bunch of times over the course of these episodes. And I'm sure it will build to something that's a lot more impactful. But the point is that we're used to now the change that's happened with the Bad Batch. After the initial, opening group of episodes with Order 66, them going away from the Empire, and now the chips are removed, so they're truly on the run, separated. We're used to the dynamic that they're in now, but it still feels like they're sort of spinning their wheels a little bit in terms of like, okay, what is the Bad Batch really trying to like accomplish in all of this? They want to keep Omega away from bounty hunters. They've resolved their debt with Sid, but they're still working for her, which I guess is fine. And I guess this episode was highlighting that they care about her a little bit more than just, someone who gives them missions. But what exactly are we doing? And that, like I said, it was a bit of a weird contrast to go from Crosshairs, can I have permission to hunt down the Bad Batch? Permission granted. No, not this week. I don't think I will this week, no. So that was a little bit kind of like, okay, fine. But it also was a signal that the Bad Batch themselves are in a bit of a holding pattern as characters, because the plot is more reliant on the other characters doing stuff. And then, like I've said many, many times before, I think the plot with the Kaminoans, the bounty hunters, what Rampart is trying to do with getting rid of the clones, that is much more of the interesting plot to me than directly the whatever story about the Bad Batch themselves. And this is what I think they're going to need to accomplish quite heavily in going into the kind of finale group of episodes, is prove to me why this show is called The Bad Batch and why I should care about that going into a potential season 2, and why this show is not just basically the Clone Wars sequel show. Let's say like they just call it sort of the the Empire, the start. They just call it, like, just for the sake of this discussion, like the start of the Empire. I know it's not a good title for a show, but that is effectively what they're showing in terms of world building in the background. The start of the Empire. And it's a show that just happens to involve the Bad Batch as sort of our lead characters. But with episodes like the Ryloth two-parter, you're showing us that you can tell stories involving other characters that we also sort of care about, that can give you a new angle on some of the rebel factions that are beginning to be set up. You can also go down this road or that road. But the Bad Batch is just like a core that we follow through. And right now, it feels like they're in a bit of a weird spot where they want to have the Bad Batch in every episode, but it's sort of clear that they don't have enough stories for the Bad Batch to necessarily be the absolute focus of every episode. So that's where I think the plot needs to kind of jump into gear a little bit more. And I'm hoping the finale has maybe some resolution on some things and puts us into a position where it's a bit clearer about where we're actually going with these characters. And that's really all I'd say, is that, you know, it has been telling that a lot of the early episodes this season were heavily reliant on it's the Bad Batch and this cameo character that you really care about. That they're aware that the problem from the Clone Wars arc is still there. They fixed it a little bit with Omega, but they're still holding back with Omega. And Omega, to a degree, for the last little while, has also been in a little bit of a holding pattern of just the rough same character arc dynamic coming out in every episode of Hunter is going to make more of a soldier's decision, whereas Omega wants the decision making made from more of a personal point of view. And that's basically what they've done the last while. Where are we going truly with this? Obviously, some sort of a Bad Batch and Crosshair's showdown, probably one where they get to talk to him a little bit and actually sort things out, see where we're at with regards to Crosshair's injury, the chip, how do they handle that, especially if they communicate with him and say, you have a chip that is causing you to act this way. It activated with us and we got it removed. You could do the same. You don't have to do this. Like, that's the conversation we're waiting for. So there's that. I'm sorry for not really focusing too much on the actual plot details of this episode, but it's just, it doesn't feel that important. Like, they just went on a mission to get some spice, and then they talk about, this place is infested and it's just bugs. And, like, again, we've seen that before. The Mandalorian's done it. I think Rebels did it a few times. Bad Batch has already sort of done this as well. Where, you know, this episode specifically, I think that's another angle on why I think people are going down the filler road of, like, oftentimes it does feel like when they don't really have a great idea for an episode, it's like, well, let's create a kind of threat in the episode by just having a random, like, bug-like creature threat be a thing. And once again, that was what they did here. The character, what was his name? Like, Roland or whatever, was, like, fine. If he comes back, I guess it will be okay. But again, tell me more about what this underworld plot actually is. Don't leave it all for just, like, you'll find out the true importance of this character in season 2. Like, give me a reason to care right now. Name dropping a character that I don't think we know anything about as, like, this, like, underworld leader is fine, but, you know, give me more of a reason to actually be invested in this. That's just this episode. It did the usual thing you expect. Had a decent bit of, you know, generic action. The characters were the characters. Sid, I suppose you come out of this and I suppose Sid and the Bad Batch have more of a kind of closer relationship now, but, you know, do I still want a ton of focus on that? not necessarily because I'm more interested in sort of where we're going kind of beyond this. And like I said, I think for the future of this show, you probably do need to be willing to do a few more things, like the Ryloth two-parter. And I think you have to be willing to maybe have an arc that maybe doesn't really involve the Bad Batch, because like we don't want it to just be this situation where like the Bad Batch happen to encounter every single character of importance from this era. So to make it feel a little bit more realistic, have some stuff happen in the background using stuff you've set up from before, in that, like, say Cad Bane. I think a lot of people are maybe anticipating another Cad Bane Boba Fett showdown. Does that have to happen with the Bad Batch involved in the same area? Because you can still do the thing where like Boba gets to meet Omega and you get whatever connection you're trying to do there, if there is one. But his feud or whatever it is with Cad can be its own separate thing if you need to. And so it's just that weird kind of back and forth. What way do you actually want the show to be? And in my opinion, across these initial 13 episodes plus the Bad Batch arc from the Clone Wars to develop these guys, I'm not sure if the series being as focused as it is on the Bad Batch is necessarily what's going to make the show better. Now, I say that before we've got to the finale and see what exactly we are doing. In that, if we get to a point where Crosshairs, they defeat him, they get his chip out, he rejoins the team in some way, that's gonna, I think, change the dynamic. That's a character dynamic within the group I'm actually invested in. Whenever they reveal a little bit more about Omega, that's going to change some things. And I assume we'll get answers or approaching answers in the final few episodes. But this episode didn't do any of that. So all I can say is, like I said at the start, very, very, very average. And I think I went into this episode with the mindset of like, anything is going to impress me here, because I waited to watch this episode until after I watched the Olympics opening ceremony, which was an absolute bore for most of the event. So anything was going to be more sort of stimulating to me than watching that. I was still sort of feeling that, like, yeah, this is not really great. And I think that's very telling. That anything would have impressed me, but I still came out of a feeling like, is it just me, or is that really, like, average? And it was. So, yeah, I'll just put this down as the first sort of, like, miss of the season in a show that in general has been quite good, with the expectation that the remaining, 3 episodes, they need to get back on track soon, and I'm hoping they do. I think the title of the next episode makes it clear, yeah, this is what we've been waiting for, War Mantle or whatever it is, that is the thing we want to get back to. Yes, that should be good. So next week should be a return to form, I hope. So yeah, they're my thoughts on the episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.